we're truly a chemically coping society. So you asked earlier about, why is it that they just offer us a pill? I think we offer a pill for a lot of reasons, and probably the fact that we have a whole industry that wants us to give pills, and there's a monetary solution there is part of it. But pills are what patients want. We want an easy solution that's external to us, that doesn't take much more work than, swallowing with a glass of water. And when there is work, we find that, we're not oriented as a society to want to do that work.
The word wellness gets tossed around quite a bit these days. Often it's used to sell goods or services ranging from vitamin supplements to personal training. But even when the word is used correctly, there's a misconception about what it means, even in the medical community. Today's guest, Dr. Scott Fishman, is an expert on wellness and wants us all to better understand what wellness means for all of us. I want to get into this notion of wellness, and I think maybe for us to approach it in the most realistic way or the most effective way would be to immediately dispel and talk about what wellness is not. Because it seems to me that word has been appropriated by a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. Your focus on wellness is more organic, more true to the actual definition of the word. So can we start there? Tell me what wellness means to you.
Well, the first thing that I'm struck by the word is a little bit of a trauma reaction, because it's a word that really everyone's for and no one really is in agreement about. So it makes it a treacherous kind of place, although it's a great entry place. Wellness is about, being well, and being well is about, I think, being resilient and able to enjoy life. But it means much more to many people in different ways. So the way that we look at wellness in my office, I run the Office of Wellness Education at UC Davis, which is really in many ways more of an advocacy group for a really needed change in the way we provide healthcare and the way that we train healthcare professionals. The way that I look at it is, how do we help people avoid the services that we're really good at providing? We're not trying to get rid of services to help, but once you're in this system and you see how we provide healthcare, you realize very quickly that we're really not a health system. We're a disease response system, and that occurs not because the health system is opposed to wellness, but because of the way that the economics and the social drivers push us. So if you're asking me what wellness is all of those things that allow us to have lives that are whatever we would describe as quality lives, lives where we can avoid illness, and thus lives where we're resilient.
So when I hear the word wellness, like you, I have this very visceral response to it, usually because I associate it with, I'm going to be sold something. I'm going to be sold some vitamin pack or something, or some workout regime or regimen, so what you're saying is, not only has there been an appropriation of the word wellness for commercial purposes, but even the medical community has kind of misread the word. Because I know that you, like cops at the scene of the crime, very famous Jeff Buckley lyric, you are cops at the scene of the crime. Crime's already been committed. That's not the time to introduce wellness. Wellness is the thing you do upstream so that you can avoid having the crime, right?
Yeah.
So there's a misperception even within med.
Yeah, and that's a lot to unpack there, because, it starts with this idea of the visceral reaction to wellness. I don't know that it's a visceral reaction that you're having to wellness as much as to the wellness industry. So the problem is, and as you said, it's been appropriated, it's been monetized, commoditized, and that's the problem. That it's really become a capital opportunity, or I think an exploitative opportunity, because we don't really address it in ways that I think are less economically constricted, let me say. But with that, when you really look at wellness, it's the part of health that doesn't need a diagnosis to get help or to make changes in our lives. That, again, these are a lot of definitions or a lot of information around something that's really hard to define, because of all the different ways we think about what a quality life is, what a healthy life is. I mean, just think about what's happening right now around diet and what to eat. It's hard enough to know what to eat just based on everything that's available, let alone how much protein, how many carbohydrates, is it meat or not meat, plants, whatever. And what's happening politically with that. So all of these things make this a difficult area for society in general. And medicine is completely siloed away from it, I think in some ways intentionally, so that it can function. Medicine is so highly siloed anyway. We have these crazy beliefs that we can actually separate the body from the mind. We can separate the heart from the kidneys. We can separate nutrition from food even. So the idea of wellness in American healthcare is, really juxtaposed in a way that is very much opposed to what we really do. Now, with that said, I don't think anyone's opposed to changing that, except that it's very, very hard once the ship is kind of moving the way that it is.
Do you find that in medical education that future doctors are kind of being trained to think chemistry, or there's got to be a pharmacological solution to these things, and that's their first response, as opposed to if I'm a primary care physician, or that's my aspiration to be a primary care physician, how do I advocate for my patient's health without having to say, oh, you know what, you need to be on this or that or whatever. Do you find that there's a resistance to embracing wellness in that capacity?
Well, so we'll start with your first comment about, are they being taught about molecules as opposed to people? And the fact is, yes, they are. And that's because there are so many molecules and there's so much to learn. And again, we have a system where you don't get in without a diagnosis. We're a disease response system. So it's, if you take that to the next step, we're training our healthcare providers to be disease responders. And when someone comes in ill, we're going to be prepared with the most immediate treatments, which usually are molecular or chemical or some kind of invasive intervention to stop a urgent problem. Then there are those problems that are more chronic or less urgent, let's say. And then we have the luxury of maybe thinking, maybe we won't do surgery and we won't give you a toxic medicine, but we'll give you a cream for your skin, and it's just never gets to that point where we have the luxury of saying, hey, you came in today to see me because you don't want to have a disease and you'd like to avoid all of those other interventions. And what can I do as a healthcare provider to help you have a life where you actually never need a hospital, or it's not that you won't need medical care, but the medical care you need will really be defined very, very differently. So that kind of is how we train our folks, and we need to change that. If we're going to make changes, which, I would say right now there is a window of opportunity in our country because at least this is being discussed more. And I think there's a recognition that we are really heading into trouble territory in terms of sustaining the healthcare that we have now if we don't address the problems that this kind of healthcare has created, like the epidemic of chronic illnesses. So there's a recognition of this, even if it's just driven economically, like all the other drivers of healthcare. Chronic illness is we have more chronic illness in our country than most, probably more than most first world countries. We spend more on healthcare than any country in the world, and we have some of the very poorest outcomes. in reflection of that, or in comparison to the dollars that we spend. And yet we can't get our arms around how do we reverse that. And the chronic illness that we're seeing is it is growing so fast that it's actually taking the space that's needed for the acute illness, and the illness that could be treated fairly rapidly, with cases of medical need that actually can't be cured but could have been prevented. So there's a growing understanding that there's a lot that we could have done that we didn't do, kind of like, what you said, Ed, that, if you could have known before the crime could have been prevented. There's very good data that shows us that we can prevent most chronic illnesses, or at least mitigate what the course will be. Even if you're going to get a chronic illness, we know that a healthy lifestyle will make you more resilient and robust, so that the secondary effects of that illness won't be as great. The functional impact won't be as great to you, and your quality of life won't be affected as severely, and your quantity of life won't be as short. So I don't know if that gets back to your ultimate question, but that's the big issue that we're facing, and why there is an opportunity here now that I don't think any of us expected 20 years ago. And it's sad that it took us getting to this point, but we are clearly at that point.
Yeah. As you were saying that, I was thinking about my personal experiences with my physicians and with the medical people who surround me, who are all brilliant, and I never ever want to take anything away from them. But it seems to me the conversations I've had with them have been, if you don't change your ways, we're going to put you on this medicine or something like that. It's like, they'll say, like, you are at risk for X. Okay, well, how might I sidestep that? And the answer is almost, well, diet and exercise, or it was something like that. Okay, I eat well and I exercise already, so that maybe that's not, but it's just the allusion to that sidestepping of the medicine is always seems to be a little bit vague to me. So I have to ask, in your opinion, is the medical community, do you think, at least as it is built now, the right people to put in wellness in their hands of, or do you think could you educate healthcare providers to be more wellness focused, or is it kind of like separating psychology from police officers? Instead of expecting the police officers to be your therapist.
Well, I think the answer to this, but it's very much like trying to separate the celery from the onions in the broth, because it's about our lives, and we need our healthcare providers to be able to understand our lives in their whole form. So it's what's really been called whole health. And that's the model that we're trying to perpetuate. It's a model that is actually being advanced by many groups. One in particular, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health at NIH in Washington, has spent the last decade trying to advance this model. It's an interesting idea. Maybe if we had a wellness core, and an illness core, it would be better, but I don't think so, because of really what you said, that, you can't separate the mind and the body, and you can't separate your current function from your future function. It's very hard to separate, kind of what you put in your body and what you do with your body, and what you put in your mind and what you do with your mind, with what has happened in your life before you made those changes, and what are your circumstances after. So, we're all going to have a journey into a different state. We're all changing. For most of us, we're not going to get stronger as we get into our 70s and 80s, although there's evidence that some people can. As we get to the point where we're going to die, we're going to have illness. What we know is that people who are robust and resilient as they enter those phases, suffer a far less amount and are able to maintain quality of life that makes life worthwhile. And one of the things that I've often thought about with my patients is that I can see that, most of us know longevity or length of life in the United States has increased. The question is, are those people who have benefited from that increase actually happy about it? And that's the worry that I have, is that you see people who are living longer, but they're weak and they're not able to actually enjoy their lives. And so many of my patients at that point say, I really don't want to live this way. I've seen plenty of people who go into that phase, even with illnesses like, metastatic cancer, who have lived robust lives, well lives, and have quality up to the end. So I think in many ways that's the problem that we have. We've become victims of our own success because we define success in the wrong way. Longevity health shouldn't be about making your life endless. It should be making, putting the health back into our lives, or the life back into our years.
Yeah, that's excellent, and I absolutely agree with that. And the personal examples of who I know going through my head on each side of that camp, people who've had incredibly filled lives, very wonderful, high quality of life, and then ended, and people who felt like they were running a marathon, to ultimately get nowhere. And I think everybody probably has those stories of the folks that they know on either side of that. But I'm going to get back to something you had mentioned earlier, the United States, the outcomes in the United States, and the culture that we've kind of built around. And maybe it has something to do with capitalism, the fact that there's profit to be made in chemical solutions or something like that, which is why we don't really invest in it. But what countries have you seen that you think serve as really good models, and what do they do differently than what happens here?
Well, that's a loaded question, let me get back to that by just going back to where we are. We're truly a chemically coping society. So you asked earlier about, why is it that they just offer us a pill? I think we offer a pill for a lot of reasons, and probably the fact that we have a whole industry that wants us to give pills, and there's a monetary solution there is part of it. But pills are what patients want. And we want an easy solution that's external to us, that doesn't take much more work than, swallowing with a glass of water. And when there is work, we find that, we're not oriented as a society to want to do that work, that we'd rather go use our insurance to cover, or to go to some external source to have something done to us. It's called an external locus of control. So I would go to countries that actually engender an internal locus of control. And there are many of them. I can't tell you one versus the other. I honestly don't know the statistics. But you can see in their outcomes, they tend to have health systems that are much more socialized, not so much socialist, but socially based. They're not based on who can afford it and who can't, because that makes inequities that actually come back to undermine society. I'm not looking to advocate for a single payer system, but there's something about the way that we provide care, and you have to pay up front, and then you might have a big payment on the backside as well to get it. And there is a social nature to being well. It's again, being well in our libertarian society is looked at as a self-care issue. I think a lot of the reason why we don't, as a country, look at our communities supporting our wellness is because we do have this libertarian value, and that it's looked upon each of us to take care of ourselves, to take care of our finances, to take care of our families, and that's a big ask. I don't think it's communism or socialism to try to live in communities that support each other, and supporting each other's wellness is something that we know from data actually produces a pretty robust outcome. So if you ask me about where is it better, it's better in places where they do that. So rather than countries, I don't know if you're familiar with the blue zones. Mm-hmm. Blue zones are very interesting in that these are areas in the world that they were first actually noticed by a National Geographic reporter who saw that these were where people seemed to live longer. They seem to be happier, and they seem to have less chronic illnesses. And then he looked more deeply into what were the elements of this. And what you find is that, and I have to put a caveat on this because I'm not advancing this as science. Sometimes I see that it is. I don't think it's science. I don't think that this is really metricized, objective observations. But it's really clear when you look at these communities that they are communities that do a few things. One is they eat a reasonably healthy diet. It comes down to what the heck is a healthy diet? And I would say really there's no one diet that we know is healthy. The Mediterranean diet is, if you go back to, when did diets start? The Mediterranean was kind of the beginning of, many civilizations, and it kind of grew globally. So the Mediterranean diet really has global influences, but it's a diet that is diverse, and it is plentiful in whole food. And it's not too much of any of those whole foods that are dense foods, and more plentiful in plants. So, the idea that you have to be a vegan to be healthy is something that some people might argue would be a very, if you want to reduce your risk in life, that's one way to do it, but it's easy to be an unhealthy vegan as well. So, we have a real discussion about that. But when you look at these blue zones, you see these are communities where people, they eat a reasonable diet, and their diets are pretty consistent. That, they eat food that's from their region, it's local. They don't completely avoid alcohol, but they use it socially. And they use it socially because they're social. They have connections within their communities, and they live in communities that actually support or stimulate the wellness practices that we believe are important, like eating well, social connectivity, sleeping. I'm sure I didn't come with these on the top of my head, but I think there are 8 different categories. Movement, they have lives in motion, which is very, very important. We in the United States, it's hard to eat all whole food. We're inundated with food that may look like it's good, but it's processed, and it's basically been produced so that it gives us the thing we think we need in excess of the things we haven't realized yet that we need. So that's the problem with processed food, which you're hearing a lot about in the news now. These communities are really living with food that is local to them. We can do it, but economically it's hard to do it here. We are more isolated than, outward facing and connected. If you look at some of the crises we have, in healthcare, we're trying to help people to become functional and associated with a quality life. We have a society that's almost looking to become dissociated. If you look at the drugs and the cannabis and alcohol and all of that. But it doesn't mean that those things can't be a part of life if they're used in socially engaging ways. And all of those things have a socially engaging component, and you see that in the blue zones. We don't really see it as much here, but I think that it's starting to catch on. And when you look at the data around what is a well life, those are really the elements. So even though I don't think the blue zones are science, I do think that they captured what are the basic elements. And we have a lot of research to do to figure out exactly what to eat, exactly how to move, exactly how much sleep you need, how to even fall asleep for many of us, and how social engagement really does affect us. But we know that these are the things that if you came to me and you said, I want to have a well life, I'd show you that list and say, let's talk about how, set goals and how you would meet those goals.
And one thing that jumps out at me as you were going through that is that so totally transcends the role of a single provider. That is a communal kind of a thing. Like that's driven by a societal engine. A lot of what you're talking about, like the interconnection of people, that's nothing. No doctor's going to say, "Oh, you need to go hang out with people," or you need to go join a commune or something, or farm and move about. Like as I mentioned earlier, like I have been told, move more, get exercise, watch your diet, and so on. But it's not been with any specificity, so it's just kind of like a vague illusion. So if you were, and you are, because it's kind of like what you do for a living, in a place where you were going to recommend, how does the world embrace wellness in this more holistic capacity, in such a way that we are not couching it under the definition of medicine, but it is really more, it is its own thing. And medicine kind of fits under the umbrella of wellness, not vice versa.
Right.
So what do you see as a viable system? If you could wave a magic wand, what would you have us look like?
Well, it's a good question. It started with the idea that you go to your doctor and it's outside of the expectation that you would get something like this, but it really shouldn't be. The word, I think it's the word doctor, is linked to teacher, not to giving people pills and medicine. It's a teacher, and it's the role is to teach people how to have healthy lives. And I think, there are good analyses that suggest that if we actually stop doing some of the expensive things we do and start doing the inexpensive things, like saying, rather than putting you on a statin or, having you come in every day to have your blood pressure taken, or even worse, have you come in for a endoscopy, or, let me have you work with a team. Now, it is more than I think any one clinician can do themselves. It takes teams, but we have teams for all sorts of things, horrible things we do to people. Why don't we have teams for the good things we can do to people? And I can see the future being that, because economically it's much more favorable and optimal than waiting till people break down and trying to fix them as inadequately as we do. I mean, we're very good at saving lives, and just like you want to have your doctors. I don't mean to imply that we shouldn't have the best disease response system possible, but if we actually did those things on the front end, we would have a lot more room for the person in the waiting room who's there for 16 hours, who broke their arm, who couldn't be seen because there are people who are on the edge of dying for the 5th time that week, in the emergency room. That's why you're waiting. And we would have room really to address people pretty quickly and much more thoroughly with the treatable or the illnesses that we can easily treat.
And it sounds to me like that team could easily be expanded to incorporate educators. There's got to be an educational component to this that makes people from a very young age aware that this helps.
Physicians are teachers. That's
Right.
what we're supposed to be, and that's what we should be doing. And it is really what we're doing, because we're advisors. We're not parents. We're not inside of you. We are your advisors. And if your doctor tells you to do something, many people feel like they have to do it, but really it's your choice. You get to decide. And so we're your advisors. So in many ways, we have to be your teachers. And again, that's the paternalistic part of medicine that I think is evolving, but it has a little ways to go.
And I think where I was going, I apologies for misspeaking, but where I was going was more curricular, like to embed this in like a K through 12 education, so that, this is a path toward happiness, toward healthiness. And we seem to be, this is a path toward you being a more effective factory worker, Well,
it's the education. So absolutely 100%. It's the education point, for when do we get the consumer involved? The beginning is also, how do we, turn the boat in how we educate our, clinicians who are being trained to just respond to disease. They don't even know that it's part of their scope of practice, because they can't see any place for it. There's, everything's so jammed, and, they're seeing multiple, more people than they can imagine, even in a day, just responding to that disease. We have to change that at that front. But going back to the kids, that's the time to change. That's the time to make our children as resilient as possible, and the idea is to, help them with not only, what they eat and how they move, but really how they think. We've got a generation that is focused on a small screen. And, I think most of us recognize that being present and being aware is an important part of quality of life. And we can really train our minds to be that, or we can train our minds not to be that at all. And, we've learned a lot about that. So again, it's, we've talked a little bit about what you put in your body and what you do with your body, but what you put in your mind and do with your mind is very, very important. And it's, in my opinion, one of the harder things to change for people, just to get over the energy of activation to that change, if you didn't have some resilience early on. And if you did, it's a transition that's actually fairly natural as life goes on. So I think we should, get kids to learn to be present and to be mindful and to be aware, both internally and externally. But it's going to now we have another obstacle, which is the computer screen or the phone screen and the short attention span of Instagram and things of that sort.
Yeah. And not to dismiss any value in that, because I think that has extended our capacity to be integrated. I know my son, for instance, has friends in countries he's never visited, and like that, and he's found his people. Like these aren't just passing friendships. So I think there's a value, but at the same time, the misinformation that floods his brain and his eyes during the course of a day, that increases his anxiety, and I'm sure this is true for so many people. It actually can do more harm than good. Yeah, there's a facility for connecting, but I don't know whether that connection replaces a one-on-one human interaction. I've got to think no. Knowing that other people are out there who think like you do is value, and that's great, because I think there's a lot of psychological bolstering that happens through that, but at the cost perhaps of a real full life, is I guess what you're saying.
Well, again, I don't want to demonize Instagram or podcasts. Every now and then I find myself in a podcast, and I've got to be careful what I say. But and again, I don't think you can demonize these things. You can just compensate for them, and if you look at many of the things that are ills, we don't have to get rid of them. You don't have to avoid eating things that bring you joy. You just don't want to eat them exclusively. At the exclusion of real nutrients. And the same is true for the brain. You don't have to avoid things that bring you joy, but if you do it exclusively, something's not going to be getting in. and you're going to be training. And this is why it was I was struck by your relating this to kids. It's a very developmental stage. So and we know this in many other ways. We know that kids are that kids are in a very positive way open to learning and training, and it's an opportunity, but they're also vulnerable to learning other things. And this is something that has happened now, and we can potentially augment it. I don't know, I think it's like prohibition. If you take this stuff away, it's going to find its way back. It's part of our lives. But the thing is that we can supplement it in a way where we understand that it's a deficiency. The one thing we haven't talked about, and maybe you want to, is the idea that everybody's on supplements, but no one can tell me what they're supplementing. And it's kind of like spinning the wheel, hoping that we catch the one thing we're missing, as if all the other things don't have an impact on us, that aren't doing anything for us. The same thing's true with the mind. We have a problem, and we can supplement that by helping our young people to understand the importance of focus, of being calm, and the internal power that we have to intentionally direct our awareness and control our awareness, because that's an incredibly powerful tool for being well later in life.
That's pretty amazing. That's the power of the mind. So, all right, I'm not going to try to summarize everything here, because this is well beyond my capacity to grasp the depths of everything we're talking about here. But this touches on everything. This touches on what you put into your body, what you put into your mind, how you connect with other bodies and minds around the world, and then this is where I stop talking, because I can't visualize beyond these ripples, because I keep coming back to thinking about what do I need to change in me? Like, as you're talking, I'm like, oh man, I missed an opportunity there. I think like it's Scrooge. I'm too old to change my ways, which could very well be. I don't know, but I do know that, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit. I have friends who have experienced traumas. I have a good friend who was diagnosed with cancer, with prostate cancer, and changed his life in really radical ways. And I actually know quite a few people who have stories like this. They've come to that precipice, and that's where I learned about blue zones from my one friend who's kind of adopted this, hasn't gone vegan, enjoys alcohol, but definitely eats better, is more mindful with how he spends his time on the planet and how he's connected with people. He's really kind of embraced this philosophy and is in remission right now, knock wood. So what do you think about that, being brought to that edge and being shown the light, or anything like that? Hopefully we don't need that, right? Or are we there already?
Well, I think that you've now commented on both extremes of, where change can happen. It can happen when we're young and we're really open to it, before we've actually trained our minds to be savoring, short snippets and not able to kind of stay focused for long periods of time. And the other side is where we're desperate. And we find this because of some sense of desperation. And not everyone who's desperate is able to find it, like your friend. So I think that's good, but it speaks to, I suspect if I asked your friend, if you could go back, would you have done these things earlier? And I'm sure your friend would have said yes, because it helped. Is it him? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you said it. It helped him in a time of distress, but it improves all parts of his life. And, what he probably found, I would bet, is that the food that was the healthier food, he started to actually crave, because the sensory system of taste, really, if with an evolutionary influence, is rapidly changing, because it would be evolutionarily problematic if, we're in the wild and, we don't like the food that's available. So it tends to change. So if we push ourselves to eat a healthy diet over a while, we stop craving the things that we think we're stuck on. I've had people say to me, I just could never not eat cheese. And I think, well, if you were on a desert island, would you die if there wasn't cheese? Well, maybe some people would say yes, I just could not survive. But most of us would find that we would accommodate to a diet that's available, and that if we allow ourselves to use our intelligence around what we do know about whole food, I think once you do it, you find that you actually it's fulfilling in other ways. Alcohol is a really interesting subject area because for a while we sent messages, particularly from this region in the world, that alcohol may be health producing. It may be a healthy thing to have, which is only correct in that for many of us, alcohol is used really as a social lubricant, as a way for us to engage, and it's the benefit of engagement, not the benefit of alcohol. As you may have said, I'm a pain specialist, a physician that practices pain management, and we don't often kill nerves to treat pain, but sometimes we have to, particularly in terminal illness when pain can really become a problem. We can kill the nerves, but guess what we use to kill the nerves? Alcohol. So, that's what we're putting in our bodies. Now, we put a lot of things in our bodies that, if put in excess, are toxic, but aren't in excess in moderation. And I would say alcohol is probably one of those, that there probably are safe ways, or, really, I hate to talk about safe, but safe is relative to the risks and the benefits. Alcohol isn't really nutritious, but it is helps people relax. It helps people connect. The thing you see in the blue zones is alcohol is really never used alone. It's used in social settings, and it's never used in excess. After a drink or two, there's probably is no safe level in terms of harming our bodies. But, people who feel like I can never have a drink is probably not a problem. That's like saying I can never go outside because the sun causes cancer, and so we live in this risk benefit analysis of a life where at the end of the day, if you're so worried about the risks or you're overly focused on the benefits, it's going to be hard to make wise choices. But if you're kind of able to manage just both of those and make choices and live your life, you'll probably find that you can make choices that are pretty healthful. Now, getting back to, your point about, this world that we live in and how do we make change. I think getting people at their earliest stage to have a culture and have a understanding of the importance of this in terms of how we benefit from our lives immediately and how we can grow to benefit from life as we go on as early as possible is the way to do it. But just like your friend, I think people can change at any point. And there are lifestyle changes that any of us can make at any time. I think it's not so much the change or the actual process of the change that you would make. It's the making of change that gets harder as we get older, in that we have all sorts of barriers to believing that we can't change.
I would agree with that. And the first thing that pops to mind is the commoditization of alcohol, the way alcohol has been marketed. It's been branded as, they're taking that simple premise that this is a social lubricant and they are turning it into this aspirational lifestyle. Like if you only drink Jägermeister, or whatever by the gallon, these wonderful things will happen to you. And it's hard to watch those tectonic plates kind of come and smash into each other when you've got this in moderation. No. There's no such thing as moderation. You buy as much of this as you can afford, and that's going to make your life so much better. Trust us. And then there's that realization that, along the way, that it's a shame it ever has to be that catastrophe would be the eye-opening event that would bring someone around to realizing that. I'm happy to have my friend still on this earth because I really value his life and his friendship. But I would have had it gone a different way if I could have, as I'm sure he would have. But let me go back like a 30,000 foot view on this entire topic and say, you are charged with educating healthcare professionals. What do you sense is the receptivity to this notion that wellness is not something to be brought in after the diagnosis is made? Are professionals open to this idea?
I think they're very open to understanding it. I think we're early. This is one of those things that once you get it, it's like, how could we have not gotten this sooner? But we're just opening up to it because the biases are driven by other forces, like economics, or, we have a culture of, you go to the doctor gives you something. It's not the other way around. The doctor's not there when you're not sick. There are people who talk about we should pay doctors for how many patients that don't get ill and don't pay them for the illness part. But I think that it's going to take a little while. I'll give you an example. At UC Davis, we are developing really what will be the first set of kind of global wellness, well-care, resilience, healthcare competencies for how we train healthcare students, medical students, nurses, pharmacists, etc. In my opinion, they all need to have a basic education in what wellness is, how wellness is assessed, how wellness is intervened upon, and how nuance affects wellness. And I'll give you an example of what that is. Kind of, different people live in different parts of the world. They have different environmental exposures. They have different economic boundaries that they can live in. Some people have cleaner air than others. Some people have better justice than others. So there are all these conditions that will change the other variables. But those are basically the 4 parts of what we need to teach all healthcare providers. We're going to be seating a national group of experts here in October to really come up with what are those objectives. Competencies are essentially the endpoint of education. And really starting by asking the question, what do we want to see in these students once we've taught them? And for years, we have allowed education to kind of roll the other way, which is, okay, we want to teach them to be good doctors, so we'll teach them about heart disease and diabetes and broken bones and anxiety and depression and infections. But really what we want them to do is be competent to be able to take care of what comes before them. And we hope that people will come before them who want to be well as opposed to come to them only because they're ill. And maybe what has to happen in the transition is that we incorporate wellness more and more as we recognize that it's something we need to support the care of economically as we evolve as health systems. And I think that there's plenty of recognition of exactly that. So that change has to happen, and that's where we're putting our focus in my office, in how do we, number one, change what we expect of our students and make sure that we can codify it in a way that we can expect all schools to be expected to be able to show how they're doing that, and that their students are coming out with a knowledge of what wellness is, as well as a knowledge that it's part of their practice, and a knowledge of how to intervene, how to assess, and kind of how one person may be different than another in terms of that wellness analysis. We're also focused on making sure that our practicing clinicians actually do understand that there's an expectation that when a patient goes to your office that you address them staying well or doing what you can to make them more resilient to diseases that might be forthcoming, even if they have another disease and you're treating that. So that's the hope, that we can show models to clinicians who are already practicing and won't have the benefit of future education that hopefully will be changing, but that's going to be fairly downstream. And then the third is to help consumers really with this vast sea of misinformation they're living in. The barrage, we started this office only 3-4 years ago, and at that point I thought, well, maybe we could intervene and have a podcast or have a website, but it's so vast. I don't know that any of those would be worth the effort it would take, and we're a small group, so how do we do this in ways that we can really get that idea out that we're a chemically coping society, so just taking a chemical supplement is probably not going to be the savior. Now, some of us are deficient in things, and a supplement might be needed, but we can tell people and get the word out that if you're taking a supplement, you should ask what you're supplementing. My mother comes out every morning with about 20 bottles that she's bought off of a TV program that she watches, and I go through them, and most of them have the same things in them in different quantities, and they're for her heart, for her brain. I did find one for her prostate, and I thought that was needed to be excluded. She feels that if they have to be right, because they can't tell you this on TV unless it's true. And I try to explain to her that this is not all true, and at very least it's redundant. And she often leaves me with the line, "Which one of us got to 94?" So, there's that part too, that, we have to live our lives. And even in the face of doing these things, there are other things that we can do. We're not going to mitigate everything by trying to change our lives, but there are very, very simple things that we can do. We're trying to get that out to consumers, but I got to tell you, it's a pretty daunting task at this point.
Yeah. You've got an incredible current to swim against that's been delivered to you by capitalism, really, I guess, is like anytime a buck could be made. I think that's, although, it does, your mother's counterpoint, like, which one of us is old? That's like, true. Yeah, okay. That's kind of an argument stopper right there. But, wow. So, well, anyway, I think I am personally encouraged to know that there's receptivity out there. I know you used the word model a few times, and I think that model, something that someone can see, like, this is a lifestyle, this is a blueprint for a lifestyle that benefits more people than it hurts, whereas this fake beliefs or whatever ends up hurting more than it. I think if there was a way to show that somehow, people would get it. So I'm very glad and very grateful for your work, that you are educating medical professionals to carry forth that message that there's a different way. Is there anything that we missed in our conversation that you want to touch on?
We didn't really talk about climate change and social justice, but there's a bigger part. We tend to focus on the self, but there's a whole world that has to come together with us to all be well as well. So it's, we look at the parts that are most important, and this is what I'll end with. When you look at studies of people and who lived well and happy lives, there are studies that show it, and they all come back to the social connectivity, the meaning and purpose in life, and things of that sort. And, those shouldn't be luxuries, but they are for some of us. And, those are probably the world issues of wellness that we have to bring into the equation as well.
So when you say climate change and justice or injustice, the disparity between right and wrong, are you suggesting that rallying together, gathering around a noble cause that is for the common good? So if we came together to reverse climate change or to address it, that's a meaningful connection that is at the heart of wellness?
Well, it wasn't what I was getting at, but I think it's probably true. I think what I was getting at is that it's hard to be well if you don't have good air to breathe, or the temperature is so hot that you can't grow food. The planet's getting less well as we are starting to focus on trying to stay well or be more well. So it's an issue that we're going up the down escalator because the planet provides our nutrients and our environment that make us able to live, and we forget about that sometimes. The other part is that it's hard to be well in an unjust world, and many of us might feel, most people might sense injustice somewhere in their lives, but there are many people who have a lot more injustice than others. And those have to be factors that we think about as well in terms of kind of global wellness as it ultimately impacting the individual.
I know you do a lot of collaboration with different departments and different disciplines. It's not just about medicine. You partner with psychology, with economics. We just had Marianne Page from the Poverty Center here, who spoke about that very thing, spoke about one of the invisibles when it comes to poverty, which is lack of good nutrition. And that lack of good nutrition is a pretty huge speed bump for anyone to overcome. It could be, it would dramatically reduce your ability to actually move forward, to climb up any kind of economic ladder or something. So, and I've got to say that translates seamlessly into what you're talking about. So, yeah. So again, that's just the thing about wellness. It is a very holistic viewpoint where you are looking not just at the person, but the components that go into that person's experience. So we have to think about those things as well. So, wow, I don't envy you, the scope of your job, but I am incredibly grateful for what you do. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, appreciate it.
It was great having you. Hopefully we can reconnect again sometime, and you can deliver good news about how we're all so much weller than we were before.
All right, when we're done, I'll come back. Thank you.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Scott Fishman. If you'd like to learn more about Scott's work, check out our YouTube page for links to his bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say. We guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Y Pavilion. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.